Hello and welcome back to Dark Tower YouTube, where we're doing a deep psychological dive into Stephen King's magnum opus, The Dark Tower. My name is Michelle McEwen. I am your host, and this is a special bonus episode where we'll be talking about the name Roland, Deschain. We'll be talking about Gilead and New Canaan, where he comes from, and the poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. So there's no direct, if you read the poem, it's not a direct spoiler for the series, but we will be looking at it with a closer lens and hearing what Stephen King had to say about it and some other people, what they had to say about this poem. So if you were trying not to read the poem until after you read the book, you could maybe skip this one. But again, no direct spoilers here, I would tell you. Let's start with the name Roland. Roland is a Frankish name, and usually it means from the famous land or fame of the land. And that last one I think is the one that fits our Roland. He is the last gunslinger. He is the fame of the land. This became a widespread popular name after a semi-legendary military hero named Roland went down in battle. He served for Charlemagne's army, and he might have been related to Charlemagne or maybe just a favorite soldier. This was somewhere in the late 700s AD. His band of soldiers were off to fight the bad guys for whatever land, but got cut off. Roland's band got cut off from the main army, I think, and the bad guys came upon them and wiped them all out. But Roland and his men went down valiantly. Somebody told the story, passed it around, and people started making a myth out of this soldier Roland who went down with his horn blazing. The Song of Roland was a French creation, a poem, a song, Chanson de Roland. And in this writing, he is associated with his sword, Durandal, his horse, Velantif, and his Olifant horn. We don't have a horse in the Dark Tower yet, and I'm making this after we have read The Gunslinger together in our book club. So for those of you who have read The Gunslinger, we don't have a horse yet. We had a mule, but the mule died. Screw you and the horse you rode in on. That guy died. The horse, the mule. We don't have a sword either. We have guns. And we don't have a horn, but we've heard about that horn in the first pages of the book. That horn was left behind at the Battle of Jericho Hill, and Roland is questioning whether or not his guns are more important than that horn. So that feels like a bit of a match there. This song inspired Shakespeare, probably, and then Shakespeare inspired the poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. Or maybe both of these things did. Not sure. But we do have a line in Shakespeare from King Lear. So this was written in the early 17th century. And in this play, there's a man named Edgar who is trying to dress up like somebody called Tom O'Bedlam. And he's in costume and he's talking nonsense. So I guess the man Tom Bedlam was a foolish person. You can tell I don't know this play. So if you're a Shakespeare person, let me know. What am I getting wrong here? The line, however, that Edgar is saying, dressed up like Tom O'Bedlam, is, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. His word was still. Fi, fo, and fum, I smell the blood of a Britishman. We recognize quite a few things from that. So Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came became the name of Robert Browning's poem. Fee, fi, fo, fum, if you have watched Mickey's Jack and the Beanstalk, or any version of that story, you probably heard the giant saying fee, fi, fo, fum. King uses that in his book Fairy Tale. I remember reading that line, and we have it right here linked to Childe Roland. A child in this context is the eldest son of a nobleman who has not yet attained knighthood. He hasn't won his spurs yet, if you will. And this is Brown's poem taking inspiration from that line, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. There's no meaning for that in Shakespeare's line, but Browning's going to write a whole poem about it. He's also drawing from the Song of Roland because he brings in the idea of the horn at the end of the poem. Childe Roland is blowing his horn as he approaches the Dark Tower in the poem. So some parallels there. But Browning claimed that this poem came to him in a daydream-like state, which I think is notable because some of the most famous works of art, including Stephen King novels, came from dreams. King talks about this in On Writing. He dreamed the plot of Misery. There's other dreams that he's had that have worked their way into his writing. Paul McCartney dreamed the song Yesterday. Lots of other examples. I'm not going to go into that. But just to say, this was also a dream. And Robert Browning said, I was conscious of no allegorical intention of writing it. Childe Roland came upon me as a kind of dream. I had to write it then and there, and I finished it the same day. I do not know what I meant beyond that, and I do not know now. But I am very fond of it. So isn't that cool? So just getting this stream of consciousness idea for this lengthy poem with a lot of dark imagery in it just coming to him, and him just channeling it and writing it down and saying, I don't know what it means, not sure, but I like it. And it was done all in one day. The setting of this poem is nightmarish. It's not a nice place. It's hallucinatory. It's Childe Roland's psyche throughout the poem is unsettled, and he's not quite sure what's real and what's not. And Catherine Blass, I'm not sure who she is. I should have looked that up. Anyway, she wrote something really cool, so I'm going to share it with you here. She writes about Roland from the poem. Roland participates in a seemingly endless, futile quest deep into a landscape that he can never be certain exists outside of his own mind. He is unable to rely fully on his senses to determine his place or direction, which leaves him in mental and emotional agony. At times, he sees things that immediately after disappear, or that shift in front of his eyes. At other times, his senses abandon him completely. The speaker appears to see these images with his eyes as he would something tangible, yet his sight proves unreliable, since these supposedly concrete, observable images move in and out of his consciousness. His seeing of these figures occurs in part within his own mind and is inseparable from his conscious thoughts about seeing each. I love that so much. I did read the poem. It is like that. It is dreamlike in terms of it kind of jumps around. There's not like this happened and then this and then this. We're kind of thrown around in these dark psychological images. And the poem starts with Roland kind of listening to this old man who's pointing him. He's like, where's the Dark Tower? And the man's like, this way. And the Childe Roland is like, that guy's a liar, but I'm gonna go that way anyway. And he finds himself imagining horrible things along the way. He's crossing a river at one point, and he's imagining that there's dead bodies that he's walking on. It's pretty terrific if you're into morbid kinds of things, like Stephen King is. Surprise, surprise. But this has inspired more than Stephen King's Dark Tower series. It was an episode of Doctor Who, and our friend Alice Andre Norton that we talked about in episode 1, chapter 1 of The Gunslinger, she used the Dark Tower as inspiration for a book in her Witch World series, which I bet Stephen King knows about. Margaret Atwood, if you know her, she's pretty famous for writing The Handmaid's Tale, but a lot of other cool stories that she's written. She wrote a book called Negotiating with the Dead, A Writer on Writing. And she says the Dark Tower is a stand-in for whatever the person's fears may be. In this case, it's Browning himself, she says, and his fear of never finding a poem. Childe Roland's Dark Tower holds for each individual what that person most fears. Atwood wrote, Childe Roland is his own giant, but he is also his own giant killer. So a lot of meta ideas there, and the idea of, I'm afraid that I won't be able to write this poem. The Dark Tower is the poem. I have to get there. I have to get to the ending. But it's traumatic to be in fear of not being able to do it right. And it feels huge at the time, but I'm the only one that can do it. So all of those ideas are super cool. We also have Stephen King talking about this poem, The Dark Tower, and how it inspired his writing. Now, this was a 1989 interview, so we only have the first 2 books out from the series at the time of this interview. King says, Browning never says what that tower is, says King, but it's based on an even older tradition about Childe Roland that's lost in antiquity. And he's referring to that Song of Roland that we learned about. Nobody knows who wrote it, the Song of Roland, and nobody knows what the Dark Tower is. So I started off wondering, what is this tower? What does it mean? And I decided that everybody keeps a dark tower in their heart that they want to find. Super cool. They know it's destructive and it will probably mean the end of them. But there's that urge to make it your own or to destroy it. One or the other, King said. So I thought, maybe it's a different thing to different people. And as I write along, I'll find out what it is to Roland. So no spoilers there, because King didn't even know. He didn't know what it was. He was like, I'm going to figure it out as I write these stories. And I think, though, Roland has a dark tower. Maybe we all have a dark tower. We want it, but it's maybe not great for us. And we've already seen the Dark Tower being set up as not a beautiful summer vacation-y kind of place. So that fits with what King is talking about here. I want to talk about Roland again, as in Roland Deschain, because there's a lot of controversy about that last name, or not controversy about the last name, controversy in the pronunciation of the last name. And I just was reading something on a forum somewhere, and somebody was really mad because Stephen King was saying Deschain when he was reading The Wind Through the Keyhole, I think it was. And it's his book, it's his character, so he's obviously saying it the right way, so you can't be mad at him. And it was probably a funny post. I don't know, you never know on Reddit. But King pronounces his name Deschain. And I went and tried to dig up what I could find about this last name, and there's not a lot of information out there about it. I did find the coolest thing, though, from a surprising source. Crestandarms.com, and this is a site where you can go and buy the crest of your family's surname. So they know about family surnames and design a crest that represents that. You know what I'm talking about. They have an entry for Deschain. So Crestandarms.com has an entry for Deschain, and this is what it says. Deschain appears to be a surname of fictional origin, most notably used in Stephen King's The Dark Tower series. Its roots are not definitively traced in European genealogy. The character Roland Deschain is a gunslinger, and the name may suggest elements of chaos or disruption. Des, as a prefix, means chaos or disruption, and possibly a reference to chains or binding, chain meaning chain here. This interpretation, however, is largely speculative, as the name does not have a recognized historical or geographical lineage. I love it so much. So Crestandarms.com has a huge Dark Tower fan working for them. I guess I need to write to them and tell them about what I'm doing and that they're featured in this episode. But somebody over there is a Dark Tower freak. I want to know who it is. Thank you so much for writing that out, because there is no genealogical tracing of this name. But it totally fits. Chaos and disruption. We've seen Roland in The Gunslinger just being like, who am I? What am I doing? Why am I doing it? That feels right. And chains meaning chains. And we walk in love but fly in chains. And now we'll be looking out for other references to that word chain as we read through the series. But I love it so much. I think it's a great fit. They win. So that is Roland Deschain, and that's how I'm going to say it from now on, because I think that's what it is. So lastly, I want to talk about the places in the book. Gilead is where Roland is from. This is a real place. It's a mountainous area near the River Jordan. It means the Mound of Testimony. That's the real place. In spiritual circles, Gilead takes on a different meaning, probably even in religious traditions, where it means the high place in consciousness. So high place in the mountains, high place in the psyche. This is where the spirit discerns and witnesses to what is true and to all of our thoughts and actions, hopefully so that we can make an adjustment to our mind and to our body. We don't want our high ideals and standards to be subject to errored reasoning, because then Gilead becomes a city of iniquity. It becomes stained with blood works against our life and health. That feels like a pretty big fit to me. We do see Roland struggling to be better, do better, questioning the murder that he's been committing, questioning the hands that are committing this murder, questioning all of these things. The balm of Gilead is something that shows up in the book of Jeremiah. And at the end of The Gunslinger, I think chapter 4, the man in black is directly compared to the prophet of doom. And that was what Jeremiah was called. The balm of Gilead. So Jeremiah says, is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician for us here? He's lamenting, and he's kind of a Debbie Downer. That's why he's the prophet of doom. The balm in Gilead, though, representing salvation, healing of our wounds, forgiveness of sins. And that totally reminds me of our quest for the Holy Grail, the Philosopher's Stone. Very similar vibe here. It's a universal healing agent for deep emotional wounds. It is the cure to counteract sin. And sin, the root of that word, means missing the mark. We just missed the mark. It's not like you did so bad and God's going to punish you in hell. No, like you messed up. It's an archery term. You missed the mark. But this balm will fix that. And it's a real thing. You can go get a recipe for the balm of Gilead, and you have to use plants from that area and oils and whatever, but you can make a physical balm, but the spiritual, metaphysical meaning of it is much deeper than that, if that's why you're going after the balm of Gilead. There's a song written about the balm of Gilead, 19th century African-American spiritual, and the words go, there is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. We know that Roland is having soul sickness, and that term is used directly by Stephen King. We hear a lot about Roland's soul in The Gunslinger. So this is all kind of fitting for me. Gilead is in New Canaan, and this is also a biblical place. So Canaan was the promised land in the Bible, the land of milk and honey. And a story here that links us into Jericho, which we heard about the Battle of Jericho Hill. So all of these things are biblical references. Moses was leading his people out of the desert and trying to get into the promised land. They were in this in-between place. I don't remember the names of the places, sorry. But it was a liminal space. It was a stop and hold pattern. And we talked about liminal spaces in chapter 2 of The Way Station in our book club. But this is a holding pattern. We're not going back. We're trying to see what's in front of us. And just like we discussed, liminal spaces are scary. And when we look ahead, we're nervous about what's on the other side. So Moses sends out his spies. One of them is Joshua. And a lot of the spies come back. 10 of the 12 spies come back and they say, it's scary, guys. It's really scary out there. There's giants. People are going to kill us. I don't think it's a good idea. Joshua and one other man whose name is eluding me are like, no, it's good. It's okay. Like we can take on whatever the problems are over there. It'll be okay. We can do it. But the people are hearing the majority consensus and they're scared. They're probably scared anyway, but now they're hearing the spy saying like, it's really scary, guys. So these people are like, I don't think we should do it. I don't think so, Moses. Thanks, but no thanks. I think we're going to pass on the promised land. And then God gets really mad. And God's like, y'all suck. Like, I just did all this for you, and this is the thanks that you give me. Well, guess what? You can not go to the promised land. You can go back to the desert. How about that? How does that suit you? And Joshua is going to be taking over for Moses. And maybe he'll lead your children into the promised land. You're not going there, though. You're all going to die in the desert. Sorry, not sorry. Your children have a shot if they listened to my friend Joshua. And Joshua does lead the people into the promised land. The Battle of Jericho is Joshua and the walls of Jericho. So this is a biblical story, but also has taken on its own mythos, much like David and Goliath, as we talked about in The Gunslinger. Joshua and his trumpet, so he has a horn as well that's involved in the destruction of the walls of Jericho. So he marches around the walls of Jericho, blows his trumpet, and the walls came a-tumbling down, as the song goes. So there's our Jericho, making a parallel with Jericho Hill, also involving a horn, much like at the end of Childe Roland, To the Dark Tower Came. Did I forget anything? Probably, but that was enough. It's been about 25 minutes, so there's some information about Roland Deschain, Childe Roland, To the Dark Tower Came. What does Stephen King have to say about all of this? And what about these biblical places where our story is set, partly? Thank you for listening. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Thanks for commenting on these videos. Tell me what you think. Did you know any of this? Was any of this new information to you? Do you like it? I think I'm going to make other little videos, bonus videos like this one. So stay tuned for that. Until we meet again, long days and pleasant nights.